riffs are too repetitive, the lyrics make no sense. All the songs are B-sides and the cover art's a mess. There's so much here to tear apart. Listen to it for a week, now that week has passed. It's Why I Hate This Album podcast with Tim and Garrett.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Why I Hate This Album. I am one of your hosts, Garrett Harvey. Not with me, as always, co-host extraordinaire Timothy Richardson. Don't worry, Tim's just fine. In fact, he is in the building, but he has been banned from this recording due to his poor behavior. Additionally, you guys got a little upset when we did a prepisode in the middle of my solo cast, so we decided to wrap up the old solo cast and then we'll get back to your usual programming next week. Until then, though, folks, as always, if you never have, please go out to the old Apple Podcast app, give us the 5 stars. If that's not your listening device or software of choice, no problem. However, you can write, review, subscribe, follow, mention, let people know that you like the show. If you enjoy it, it makes a world of difference to us, and we really do appreciate it. Also, please feel free to reach out to us. Album HatePod on Twitter, HatePod on Instagram, hatePodMail@gmail.com. All right, formalities out of the way, folks. Let us return to the world of Mr. GG Allin. As you may recall, he was just getting good at being super gross when we had to leave off. We're going to pick GG back up in Peoria, Illinois. It's 1985, and GG's on a self-described tour, which is really just him with a bus pass and a vague idea of where he may be allowed to perform, but not sure. He's with his buddy Bloody Mess and his band Hate in support, and if you remember, Bloody had just purchased GG a very large bottle of laxatives under the assumption that he probably had a crippling heroin problem. Not yet. Spoiler alert, he will. But that very night, GG had a very different plan. So let's return to that night in 1985 as everyone in that show is about to learn what it means to attend a GG Allin concert. So I bring you part 2 of the GG Allin solo cast. GG walked out on stage in his now customary jockstrap with the band wailing behind him. Without words, GG pulled the jockstrap to one side and proceeded to poop all over the stage to everyone's shock and amazement. He then began rubbing it all over his body and throwing the excess at the audience. Everyone wanted him to stop, but nobody wants to wrestle the guy covered in his own feces, so mostly they just ran like hell. Somehow, GG and the band escaped before the police arrived, and then it was off to South Carolina. For this show, GG decided to piss all over the house, the audience, and himself, even inviting others to pee on him so he could drink it. Little did they know, GG absolutely loved drinking urine in his personal life. There was, of course, some mild violence, and just as GG was contemplating how to molest a small dog, the cops arrived, and GG was done performing for the evening. Now, keep in mind, this is all part of a concert where songs are being played in the background, and GG is, in fact, sort of singing them. The next show was in Dallas, backed by a band called the Texas Nazis at the Twilight Room. By this point, GG had begun the practice of preparing for shows alone, getting a good buzz on, and then whipping himself into a small frenzy before taking the stage. In Dallas, he pulled out all the stops. First, GG was mostly, if not completely naked for a good portion of the show. He attempted to strip a woman, and if he could have pulled it off, quote, rape her in front of the crowd. His words, not mine. Then there's the violence. GG attacked the crowd with punches, kicks, bites, but as usual, no one got it worse than GG himself. He thrashed, seized, bit, and threw his body into the floor, the crowd, and literally everywhere in between. Next came the pooping. He pooped on stage, rubbed it all over his body, and then flung the rest of it into the audience. By the end, most people had left, and those who did remain were pressed against the walls like they were trying to avoid an angry bull. The Dallas show had reached new heights, or possibly a new low, depending on how you look at it, but it had taken a major toll on GG. After the show, he hopped on a Greyhound to San Francisco for a gig he had opening for the Dead Kennedys. But he only made it to El Paso before he had to get off the bus. He'd been vomiting and sweating since the Dallas show, and it was only getting worse. He checked himself into a motel for a few days, but things still didn't improve. So, GG hopped back on a bus to Dallas and checked himself into Parkland Hospital, a hospital that both Tim and I have attended several times, and President Kennedy just that once. Once at Parkland, he learned that he had blood poisoning and wasn't leaving the hospital for at least 2 weeks. Luckily, things weren't all bad. He made friends with the guy he was sharing a room with who was addicted to opiates. The nurses had given the addict time-release capsules to wean him off, and swallowing them just wasn't doing it. So, GG taught him how to crush them up and inject them directly into their IVs using a syringe he stole from a nurse. When GG finally got out, he learned he had missed the rest of his tour dates and it was time to go home. So he called Tracy to see if she could wire him the money for a plane ticket. She, of course, couldn't because she was broke, pregnant with Gigi's child, and living with her parents. So Gigi called his stepfather, who, of course, paid to fly his broke son home. Tracy picked him up at the airport and took him to his parents' house in Littleton, New Hampshire. But Gigi had burned too many bridges to stick around in Littleton, and so he called his old boss at the laundry in Manchester to see if he could get his job back. Shockingly, this guy gave Gigi a job, but did warn him if he screwed up even once, he would be shit-canned. So it was back to Manchester. At this time, Tracy was visiting every once in a while, but Gigi was mostly irritated by her and kept trying to convince her to give the baby up for adoption when she had it. Tracy, of course, refused and hoped that he would feel slightly differently once she had the child, but Gigi pretty much just would keep treating her like garbage. She came by less and less as she became more pregnant, and Gigi became impossible to tolerate. When she did stop by, he found it particularly funny to hold a BB gun to her face and threaten to shoot her until she cried, and he would demand that she urinate in multiple glasses so that he could drink it and pleasure herself while he watched. Just classic new dad stuff. While Tracy was occupied attempting to bring a child into this world, Gigi spent most of his time getting blackout drunk with his boss from the laundry, Chuck. When not in his disgusting room, Gigi would hang out on the streets. One day, while literally just drinking on the street, Gigi met a prostitute named Tammy who said that she could play guitar and knew a bassist and a drummer who wanted to form a band. Gigi had bought a guitar not long ago and was writing new songs. He didn't really care if these women knew how to play or not, and in some ways he kind of preferred they didn't. He'd have total control, and their complete lack of any skills might actually make the whole thing more interesting. So he agreed, and Tammy Tits, Sally Sleaze, Pauline Pussy, and Connie Clit became the Cedar Street Sluts. Somehow they found a studio and recorded 5 songs. Those were Bad Habits, Sluts in the City, Blood for You, Tough Fucking Shit, and Eat You Out. In 1986, they self-released a cassette EP called The Misadventures of a Total Slut. Now, I listened to this EP on YouTube. It's not bad. I wouldn't necessarily say, hey, you must go hear this immediately, but given that nobody in the band knew what they were doing but Gigi, and even that's kind of arguable, it's not bad. They are songs. He had a really good grasp of pop songs and basic pop structure, and at least in his early work, he applied that to some of those first singles, and you can still see it here on some of the songs, but they're also very juvenile, and at the end of the day, Gigi's not very good at singing. Nothing really came of this band, and Gigi was barely holding it together himself, so he was in no condition to get them gigs, so he kind of let the whole thing just fall apart. On March 13th, 1986, Tracy went into labor. Gigi, shockingly, actually cared enough to go to the hospital and welcome his daughter, Nico Ann Allin, into the world. Nico, of course, from the Velvet Underground, and Ann from the Stooges song of the same name. Notably not present at the hospital was anyone from Tracy's family. They all very understandably hated Gigi and couldn't stand to be anywhere near him. What Tracy saw in him, I will never understand. Even through all of my research, I did not find a single moment where GG Allin showed that he cared about this woman in any real way. After the birth, Tracy returned to her parents with Nico for a few months, letting Gigi sneak over while they were at work to occasionally visit his child. And even more occasionally, Tracy would come to visit Gigi in his disgusting room. But you have to remember, that room has the body odor of a man that refuses to shower, brush his teeth, and is filled with countless bottles and bags of human waste. So maybe don't bring a baby there. Even Gigi told Tracy this really isn't a place for a child, though the remark was almost certainly more self-serving than it sounds. But because Tracy might be the only person that makes worse decisions than GG Allin, she moved out of her parents' house and into her own apartment with the baby, and immediately invited Gigi to move in with him. He had to give Tracy $75 a month that he was currently spending on his rental room towards the apartment, but he would also get his very own room to be gross and alone in. I'm not joking. Part of the deal was, hey, there's an extra bedroom which you can do whatever you want in and I'll never go inside. Unfortunately, shortly after moving in, Gigi realized that he hated living with an infant, and Tracy learned she hated living with Gigi. At first, that meant just arguing more often, but then they began to try to outdrink each other, and these are two people that already had severe drinking problems, so it typically ended in violence and blackouts. Tracy was of course angry that Gigi never helped with the baby, and Gigi was angry because there was a baby in his house. Now, if you somehow don't think that Gigi is a total piece of shit up to this point, that's gonna change right now. You see, when Gigi would get super angry that Nico was still crying, he would, quote, ping her in the face with my fingers, end quote, which would of course lead to more crying because you don't flick infants in the face. Now, I don't think he actually hurt his child, I do want to be clear about this, but at the same time, who in their right mind would ever do that to a newborn baby? That's insane. Instead of diving into the responsibility of fatherhood, GG did the next best thing. He got super into Satan. I'm not kidding. He began corresponding with a Satanist group in Canada and performing rituals in the apartment, during which he insisted everybody must leave so they did not break his concentration. I did so much reading about this, and I never was able to figure out what in the world he was doing. But he did buy several black candles, a robe, an altar, and a sword, so he must have been pretty serious. Unfortunately, his new love of the occult did nothing to improve his attitude, and GG developed a nasty little habit of hitting Tracy. They would argue, things would escalate, and GG would just begin punching her. He eventually did this often enough that the police threatened to take Nico away if the calls didn't stop. Those calls, of course, were coming from concerned neighbors and landlords, not Tracy or Gigi. This went on for about 3 months before, of course, they were evicted, Tracy and the baby moving back with her parents, and Gigi moving into an even worse boarding house than before for $35 a week. It was literally the kind of place that you didn't have to lock your door because it had been kicked in so many times you couldn't, or in some cases, there was literally no door. Somehow Gigi and Tracy were still on again, off again, while Gigi looked for new girls to cheat on her with. And the next girl was named Carol. She was new in town and ironically had moved into the apartment Gigi had just been evicted from. The two had just started, quote, dating, when Gigi began to set up another tour with Bloody Mess, where Bloody would open for Gigi reading his poetry. As before, Allin bought a 30-day bus pass and started his second U.S. tour in August of 1986. The first show was in Madison, Wisconsin at a club called the Crossbones. The crowd was packed in around 10:30 and consisted of punks, jocks, metalheads, and older straight-edge kids. Bloody went up first and tried to do his poetry, but the crowd was super not into it, and he ended by shouting at them, tearing up his own poems, and storming off stage. Next, Gigi took the stage in his trademark jockstrap with local band The Tees backing him and went straight into the song, I Wanna Fuck Your Brains Out. At this point, Gigi had a reputation, and so the audience probably knew what they were in for. They were wrong. During the show, Gigi shoved the microphone up his butt several times, got punched in the face by someone in the crowd, then shoved some toilet paper up his own ass, lit it like a fuse, predictably ending in his actual rectum on fire. During one song, Gigi punched himself in the face so hard a tooth flew out of his head. Next, a guy in the audience tried to give Gigi a blowjob before Gigi broke 3 microphones, did a full bar slide into the bass amp, and covered everybody who wasn't already covered in beer. But that's just the show he gave the people in the bar. There were a whole bunch of kids outside the bar who weren't old enough to get in or weren't lucky enough to get a ticket, but the bar had a giant Gigi-sized window facing out to the street. So he kicked off the entire show by masturbating in front of and on the window so that everyone could feel like they were part of the show. After the show, Gigi and Bloody roamed the city, crashing parties, drinking other people's booze, and getting into fights. No one's quite sure how, but at some point they got separated and woke up in completely different cities in Wisconsin. The next show was scheduled for August 10th in Chicago at the Exit, and neither man knew where the other was. Bloody made his way from Wisconsin with fellow musician Dean Dirt and the band Distress, and when they got to the club, GG Allin was standing out in front. Most of his things had been stolen in the intervening days since they last saw him, leaving him with the jeans he was wearing, his jockstrap in his hand, and for some reason, a comically large dildo. That was it. They all went on a liquor run and returned to the club to prepare, but things got off to a rocky start. When he got into the green room, Gigi pissed on the floor and took a poop in the trash can. He then took that poop, scooped it into an ashtray, and began chasing everybody in the club around with it like a child. Next came sound check, and Gigi managed to break 2 microphones before they were done. Despite all logic, the show was totally packed, and Gigi was ready to wail. He came out and began pummeling himself with the microphone till he was good and bloody while the audience hurled bottles and glasses toward the stage. Gigi returned fire with all the bodily fluids he could muster, flinging a cocktail of piss, blood, and diarrhea at anyone in a 20-foot radius. With 2 songs left, he'd left all the lights broken, several audience members had tried to fight Gigi, and so they cut the PA and tried to shove Gigi off stage. The next band, the Volcano Suns, attempted to come out and set up, but Gigi wasn't real thrilled about that, so he punched their bassist in the face. This, of course, started a chain reaction of violence through the crowd, focused almost exclusively on Gigi. Gigi and his backing band managed to get to the street and escape to a friend's waiting car before things got too serious. Excited from a successful show, the boys took a tour of the local pornography stores before stopping off at a well-known gay bar. There, Gigi learned that his jockstrap and willingness to dance on the bar earned him more than a couple of free drinks. They all woke up the next day at the bus station to learn that all of their remaining possessions had been stolen and Bloody had had enough. But Gigi had a bus pass and $14, so off to Memphis he went. When he got there, he learned the show had been canceled, so it was off to Kentucky. Unfortunately, that show had also been canceled. He said, fuck it, I'll go to Mississippi, where, as you can probably guess, listener, the show had been canceled. The word was out nationwide. GG Allin isn't worth your headache or the bills you're going to have to pay to fix your club. Without a plan, GG returned to New Hampshire with no band, no gigs, and no idea what to do next. Somehow Tracy was still in the picture, even letting GG move back in with her again. But now she was a mom, so GG pretty much just used her as a chauffeur. That was until, of course, she got a DWI because she was still a raging alcoholic, and then he mostly just treated her like a roommate that he really hated. Never satisfied with just one woman, or even two, GG kept seeing Carol, the woman that was living in his previous apartment, and began hanging out with two women named Sheila and Trisha that would have quote-unquote parties at their house every night. Over the next several months, GG managed to get into even worse shape by almost all measures. It was so bad that even his party friends were sick of him. They were tired of his fighting and stealing, his urinating everywhere, and his new obsession with all things scatological. What's crazy is that even though Tracy hated GG for all the reasons I've already told you, she still took care of him and all of his weird GG needs. Not only did she make sure that he had something to eat at lunch every day before she went to work, she also knew how much GG, quote, enjoyed gross stuff. So every morning, before she left, Tracy would fill a glass with her own pee and a couple of baggies of her own waste and leave it for GG to do something with that I refuse to repeat on this show. Just think of the grossest possible thing you can, and we'll say that's it. It's probably grosser. Even this show has standards. I know they are low, but here we are. Eventually, this got old, and Tracy got tired of dealing with GG. As she was attempting to kick him out for the 100th time, he got a call from musician Michael Board, who had a deal with Reach Out International Records, or ROI, to put out a live show if he can put together a band and a gig. GG said he was game, but said Michael would have to do the whole band and gig thing. Luckily, Michael had a way better reputation than GG, so he was able to get him a gig at the Cat Club in New York and assemble a star-studded band for the show. The band consisted of Sonic Youth guitarist Thurston Moore, Jay from Dinosaur Jr., Kramer from Shockabilly, Gerard Cosley from Homestead Records, and the drummer of Michael's band, Artless. GG hopped on a Greyhound and headed to New York. The night of the show, as GG was watching the crowd of almost 400 people file into the club, a woman caught his eye. She must have felt it too, because minutes later, she was shirtless with GG in the ladies' room, watching him drink glass after glass of strangers' urine and collecting other women's underpants while he made out with her. Lost in a world of lust and urine, GG had to race to the stage when he realized the band had started to play one of his songs. Now, rather than summarize the show for you as I've attempted to do so far, I thought it would be fun to hear it in the words of someone else. So the following is an excerpt from The Village Voice by R.J. Smith about the show that night. Quote, after shitting in his hands and wiping it on his chest, then he bashed the microphone into his mouth, nose, and eye sockets, a shiny red mask spreading across his face. He stretched his jock aside and pulled hard on his little dick. He broke bottles on the ground and rolled in them. Back up on stage now, there was other stuff on the floor, vomit, and his butt and legs, besides his face, were bleeding. On his back, sometimes doggy style, Allin would shove the microphone into his anus. Then he went on to the second number. End quote. That was just one song. My goodness. After the show, Allin was the subject of several think pieces, debating whether he was a misunderstood artist or just someone with severe mental health issues that we should all stop watching and maybe help him. The debate rages on. Also after the show, GG learned that what he had done was completely unrecordable. The whole point of it was to make a live album, and he wasn't on mic half the time, and the other half he wasn't singing, so there wasn't really anything to record. If that wasn't enough, it also cost him a gig 2 nights later at CBGB's. When they heard about all the poop, they said, yeah, no thanks, we'll call Damage instead. Thanks though. So once again, it was back to New Hampshire worse off than he had left. He was back to his daily blackouts and general mischief when GG got a call from a Connecticut poet named Brian Clemens. Brian wanted to shoot an unusual short film, but it was a little unconventional and he thought maybe only GG would be willing to do it. GG, of course, told him yes, so Brian and his friend Malcolm came to New Hampshire, and the 3 men walked out into the woods together to make a movie. The short film was based on a poem of Brian's called The $20 Poem. Now, this video can be found on the internet, but I really don't recommend it. It's disturbing and not pleasant at all. But in case you're curious, in the video, Brian is tied to a tree without a shirt on. GG reads the poem while, we'll call it masturbating, playing with himself, I don't know, lightly, and acting out some of the words in the poem. Those actions include GG hitting and slapping Brian, pouring whiskey on him, putting his genitals in Brian's mouth once in a while, and both of them liberally spitting in each other's faces. By the end of the video, Brian's face is covered in blood. Now, after they cut that masterpiece together, GG took him to his friend Trisha and Sheila's apartment, ignoring the fact that he'd been thrown out of their apartment several weeks prior and told to literally never ever come back here. Lucky for him though, the girls weren't home, so GG just casually broke a window and let everybody in. Once inside, Malcolm decided to tape an impromptu interview with Brian and GG about the film they made earlier that day. Now this video, I should tell you, does not need to be sought out, and let's just say it's not available on the internet and all of you will believe me. Instead, I'll just describe what happens. First, they're talking to camera like normal people, but very quickly they take their dicks out and they have a flaccid penis sword fight. Next, they make out with each other a little bit. GG goes to the bathroom on and in Brian, and finally GG punches Brian in himself until they're both bleeding from the face. About this time, the girls came home to find that their apartment was destroyed and smelled like GG Allin, which is a combination of piss, shit, BO, alcohol, and old semen. Kind of like the mop bucket at a strip club, if that strip club was also in an active slaughterhouse. The girls chased the three men out of their house, and the men took off into the night to drive through downtown as drunk as humanly possible, until they very predictably hit a parked car. Then it was time to go home. The filmmakers returned to Connecticut, and GG hid under Tracy's bed for about 6 hours, convinced the police would track him down. A few days later, Michael called GG and said that Neil Cooper of ROIR still wanted to put out a cassette of his stuff. Since they couldn't record another show, they took the rehearsal audio from the backing band and then layered GG on top of it from other live shows that people had recorded. What was created was a collection called Hated in the Nation. To promote it, GG did an interview and a nude photo shoot with Screw Magazine. Also around this time, GG got a letter from a 16-year-old who lived in Nashua named Paula Huey. She thought GG was super cool and wanted to meet. GG, being a terrible human being and clearly a pedophile, allegedly, he wrote her back and arranged to meet her at a McDonald's near his house. The two met and, of course, checked into a cheap motel. Paula invited some friends over, and GG had a party with a bunch of 16-year-olds. But when you party with GG Allin, you better be prepared for some crazy shit. He kept getting louder and more violent, focusing most of his attacks on Paula, and eventually other patrons of the motel, called the police. With the police standing outside GG's motel room, all the kids snuck out the back, except for Paula, and GG answered the door. They kicked him out for being too loud, but not before asking, "Say, who's that child in your bed?" Unfortunately, it was late 86, maybe early 87, so when he said, "Oh, that's just my wife," the police said, "Well, that checks out, no more questions here," and went about their day. It should also be pointed out that despite looking, smelling, and acting like a total piece of human garbage, women found GG Allin charming, no matter what he did. He was with Tracy, but then there was also Paula, and then he would have these weird long phone conversations with a girl named Mary Jo Zilch from Chicago, and then there was another girl who was in the army in San Francisco named Linda, and all of them were just enamored with this abusive alcoholic covered in his own filth. I don't get it. Anyway, soon after, GG got a call from his old buddy Bloody Mess, who informed him that despite being kicked out a year prior, he had set up another gig for him and GG at the Exit in Chicago. This time there'd be no tour. GG would simply fly into Chicago, do the show, and go home. When he got there, the place was packed and the manager gave him a list of rules for the show. GG began reading through them before realizing it was just basically a list of everything GG Allin does at a show. GG threw the list away, walked out into the crowd, past the audience, to the door, out the door, into a cab, then to the airport, onto a plane, and 3 hours later, GG Allin was sitting in his living room as a crowd of 300 people wondered, when the fuck is GG going on? Back in Manchester, GG took his frustrations out on everyone around him. He'd get drunk and call people and say, "This is GG Allin, and I'm gonna kill you," and then hang up the phone. Like a child, but also like a serial killer. Unable to go out to the clubs because all his old friends now hated him, GG would just stay at home and talk to girls and fight with Tracy and drink until he couldn't see. One night, the fighting got so bad that GG began punching Tracy until she couldn't get up off the ground. GG actually called an ambulance for her, and Tracy spent the next 2 weeks in the hospital with broken ribs and other assorted injuries. Of course, Tracy refused to press charges, and her mother helped to hide it from Tracy's father, who would have literally murdered GG with a gun or his bare hands had he learned this has happened. Allin felt almost no remorse for the incident and used that time alone to get wasted and destroy the apartment of the woman he had just beaten up. And just about the time Tracy was getting out of the hospital and could have used some significant help while she recovered from the injuries Gigi gave her, he left. His old buddy Bobby Ebbs from the band Genocide called and told Gigi he was putting together a band for him, and even better, they already had a gig in Philadelphia on New Year's Eve. So, Gigi hopped on a Greyhound to New York to hang out with Bobby for a few days, and the two instantly hit it off. They spent 3 days drinking, fighting, doing a monstrous amount of cocaine, sexually and physically assaulting women, and just doing generally weird sex stuff even by this show's standards. Then it was time to hit the road to Philly for the show. They didn't pass the time with I Spy or Magnetic Connect 4. It was more whiskey drinking, intermittent fistfights, and what was described by GG Allin himself as a quote-unquote rape. Now, based on Gigi's description of the events and the fact that the victim in the car immediately ran out screaming, "Jesus Christ, they tried to rape me, they raped me, oh my God, someone do something," when they got to the club, it seems reasonable to call it a rape. Unfortunately, it was 1987, so when Gigi and Bobby said, she's overreacting, I don't think it was anything like a rape, no one needed to hear anything else. Once at the club, a couple more fistfights, some quick lines of cocaine, and a little bit of whiskey to even everyone out, and it was showtime. The club was called The Crypt, and it was packed and ready for chaos. Gigi was happy to unleash it. The set began when Gigi was tackled by an audience member over the amps, but Gigi picked himself up and Robert picked up the amps and they got to work. Gigi took a few cheap shots at the audience, whipping them up into a frenzy, but then to keep everyone guessing, he performed oral sex on Robert during the solo. After the solo, Gigi took center stage and gave himself a big old enema. It's unclear how much he was singing during this part because even if he were, he had to stop intermittently so that he could suck up the contents of the enema into his mouth and spit it at the crowd. He wrapped up the 5-song set by touching himself suggestively and then beating himself bloody with the microphone, just as everyone was largely expecting. Once again, a giant crowd of people who thought they wanted to go to a GG Allin show learned all too soon that they didn't. Feces aside, which is a crazy way to start a sentence, it was the late 80s and the place was filled with punks and straight edge dudes who were super unhappy about all that dick sucking that went on, so when the van was packed up, there was a big old group of people just waiting to beat the shit out of Gigi and Robert for being gay. The club security graciously grabbed the men and hurled them into the van as a volley of kicks and punches rained down. They were almost home free when a metal pipe swung down from nowhere and caught Gigi in the face, knocking out a few of his teeth. When Allin got back from the show, he got a call from Gerard Cosloy, one of the heads of Homestead Records and the guitarist for Gigi's Cat Club show, for that recording that went wrong. Somehow that show had impressed him, and he wanted to offer Gigi a record deal. He gave him a 3-album, 5-year deal with Homestead. They put together a band and agreed to record at the Music Box in New York City, which is actually not very far from where this show is based now. Gigi didn't meet the band until 10 minutes before the session began, but that didn't matter. He had the lyrics and they had the music. Nobody needs to practice. Before anyone could actually get started, though, they had to make a supply run. Beer for the band, whiskey for Gigi. Unfortunately, they got a little too much supplies because Gigi got so drunk that he recorded most of that record while lying face up on the ground, thrashing around like a child. The next day, Gigi had his liquor and cocaine in better balance and performed the remainder of the songs vertically. The tracks were mixed and mastered quickly, and GG Allin and the Holy Men's You Give Love a Bad Name was complete. I listened to this album, and I have to say the worst part is Gigi. His vocals are just shredded, and the lyrics are silly and gross. The songs aren't bad, but, it's erotic punk. So, just kind of mostly tacky and poorly thought out. But if you're curious what songs like Scars on My Body, Scabs on My Dick, and Suck Dog are about, they're on YouTube, and you can have at it. Even Gigi admitted later, though, that he was in fact a little too drunk for those takes and wished he could do it again. But that's rock and roll. After recording the album, Gigi took a bus to Minneapolis for another gig. He was playing a show at the 7th Street Entry with a band called the Fucking Shit Biscuits, which is kind of an awesome name. Gigi got to town early and found he got along well with the band. One night during a party while everyone was downstairs, Gigi and the Biscuits guitarist Ron stole all the underwear of the women who lived in the house. For Gigi, this was pretty much a Tuesday, but Ron seemed to think this was so funny he wore the stolen bras and panties the next night at the show. And what a show it was. It is noted for being one of the longest and most violent GG Allin shows on record, clocking in at a whopping 35 minutes. During that show, on top of all the usual mayhem and nudity and general grossness, GG managed to strike a girl in the head with the base of a microphone stand, and she was taken away in an ambulance with blood just gushing out of her head. I've actually seen this happen live at a South by Southwest show. I can say those stands are really heavy, and for some very confusing reason, the edges are remarkably sharp, so there was probably blood everywhere. GG, not to be overshadowed, picked up a broken bottle and began to carve up his chest and thighs deeper than he ever had before. After the show, GG refused to go to the hospital, instead ripping apart his t-shirt and wrapping up his weeping leg wounds. He then curled up alone with a bottle of vodka and passed out. The next morning, when he awoke in tremendous pain, he found that his legs were still very much actively bleeding. GG sat around with the band trying to drink the pain away and waiting to hear an interview he'd conducted with a local radio station before the show. Instead of hearing that lengthy interview, though, they heard this instead. Quote, "Because of what happened last night at the 7th Street entry, we feel it's in the best interest of our radio station to cancel the GG Allin interview we were going to run at this time. A girl's skull was seriously cracked during the show and is still in the hospital. We feel that GG Allin's show provokes violence and obscenities beyond the limits, and we at this station do not wish to promote that kind of action." End quote. Of course, nobody learned anything from this, and they all just burst out laughing before they continued drinking. At some point during the day, GG stumbled inside and found 5 videotapes all labeled GG Allin. Furious he was being bootlegged without his permission, GG grabbed all the tapes, packed his bag, and walked out the front door without saying a word to anyone. He took a cab to the bus station, and it was off to Chicago to meet fellow musician Sharon Rose. Sharon was like a sister to GG and took care of him when no one else would, and I don't think she ever tried to have sex with him, but it's GG Allin, so yeah, I'm sure he did. When he got to Chicago, he was still completely destroyed from his last show, and Sharon nursed him back to health. Well, not health, but he was still very much drinking himself to a blackout every single night, falling asleep on the floor and pissing himself, but he wasn't bleeding anymore and his wounds remained uninfected, so it's pretty good. Also, while in town, GG gave an interview to radio station WNUR. He showed up drunk and brought a bottle of whiskey to get drunker. He also brought some records and several baggies of his own semen to give away to listeners who could quote-unquote win his mystery goo. The whole thing went about as you would expect it to until the very end when the DJ asked GG what he thought of Chicago, and GG's reply was, quote, "There's too many N-words, although not in the 2022 version." At that moment, the interview was turned off, GG was escorted off the property, and multiple station apologies were issued. But the damage was done. GG Allin had put a target on his back, and the phone lines had lit up with people threatening to murder him. After a few weeks of staying with Sharon, GG awoke one morning, still of course drunk from the night before, to find out he was alone in the house. While searching for Sharon, he found 2 crisp $100 bills on her nightstand. Unable to ever do anything but the worst thing imaginable, GG went to his room and began packing. Before leaving, he stopped by Sharon's record collection and helped himself to the rarities and imports, and of course, grabbed that $200 off her nightstand before walking to the bus station. Let me pause again and just say, this guy's the fucking worst. He sees $200 from the woman who's been taking care of him and housing him, feeding him, paying for everything, and he's like, oh, you know what? I should just steal that and leave. Also, I'm gonna take her best records. What the fuck, man? Anyway, once at the station, GG called Tracy to let her know he was coming home, and she finally told him, no thanks. Officially homeless, GG then had to call his parents, and they agreed to let him stay in their upstairs apartment in Littleton, just as he had before with his first wife. Without a band or gigs, GG spent all of his time just drinking and breaking into other people's houses. Occasionally, he'd hitchhike down to Manchester to see his daughter at Tracy's, but only if it was well planned and her boyfriend Jimmy wasn't going to be around. GG at this point couldn't just stop in to Tracy's. He would get about 10 feet away before every neighbor in her building would call the police. When he needed a place to stay or was just bored during her visits to Tracy's, he would break into his old friend Trisha and Sheila's house and take their stuff or just, destroy things, because fuck people, right? Allegedly, according to GG, on one of these little trips, GG claims that he took Trisha's 2 cats and put them in the freezer. And while I honestly didn't find any evidence of this, and I don't think it actually happened, GG Allin is a terrible human being, and I wouldn't put it past him. But he's also a renowned liar. So, let's assume he didn't. When not committing felonies, GG would of course drink himself silly in his parents' spare apartment. He was peeing the bed so frequently that he had to develop a system so that he didn't have to sleep in the wet spot every night. So he'd piss the bed, wake up, flip the mattress, begin the process all over again. Eventually, his parents got so tired of the fact that their son never left and their spare apartment now smelled distinctively like urine, they said, GG, you gotta make a change or you gotta get the hell out of here. So GG did what anyone would do. He bought some plastic tarp for the bed and found a couple new hiding places for those whiskey bottles. And after months of doing this, the ROIR cassette that was cobbled together to create Hated in the Nation was released. It generated enough buzz that GG got a call from New Rose Records out of France who wanted to put out an album with him. GG told their A&R guy that he probably had enough unreleased material for a double LP, and the guy offered him $3,500 plus royalties to make the album. GG, of course, countered with $5,000 and no royalties. After the A&R guy stopped laughing and confirmed that it wasn't a joke, he agreed and GG signed a contract, once again making the worst possible decision in any given situation. The money, of course, was spent before the album ever even came out. In April of 1987, Jeff Clayton and Joe Young of the band Anti-Scene began calling GG and asking him to come play a show with them in Charlotte, North Carolina. The money wasn't great, and GG was hesitant, but then the band the New York Shakes agreed to make the trip with him if they could get on the lineup. The show was booked at a dilapidated 30 by 30 cinder block building with a tiny stage called the Church of Musical Awareness. The members of Anti-Scene had been ripped off by the club owner a month or so before, and figured the best way to get their revenge would be to unleash a GG Allin on them. So that night, backed by a local band, the Primates, GG hit the stage to a packed house and Anti-Scene had their revenge. The show kicked off when a guy in the crowd took out his penis, declaring it the smallest in the world. Not to be overshadowed, GG pulled out his penis, and the two men had a flaccid penis sword fight, while a punk band played and 130 people watched. Next, it was time to get bloody, so GG bashed his head with the microphone. Once the blood was flowing, it was time for an enema, which allowed him to turn his rectum into a super soaker of poop water. This is when about 40 people ran for the door, and the rest dodged GG's spray. Not satisfied with the reaction, GG returned to the stage and took a big old poop. After rolling around in it like a dog, he began hucking it at the audience like an angry chimp. That's when the next 40 people began running for the door. GG then had sex with the microphone for a bit before grabbing a woman from the crowd and pulling her on stage, ripping off her shirt in the process. Her boyfriend was not a super huge fan of this plan and punched GG in the ear. Suddenly, 3 more men joined the melee, and GG was on the losing end of a 4-1 brawl. All the while, the Primates are still very much playing music. Eventually, some band members from the supporting act stepped in and pulled GG out of the pile, and the show was over. Outside the club, people were waiting with bricks, bottles, and pipes. GG and the band raced to the car and attempted to speed away. But the crowd got in their cars and chased after them and followed them back to the Cricket Motel. They were pounding on his door, demanding he come out and take his ass kicking. It was actually irritating enough that Allin got off of his bed, stood up, and went and took a shower, hoping that when he got done, they'd be gone. They, of course, weren't, and so GG, of all people, called the police. When the cops came, a woman in the crowd told them that GG had pooped, eaten the poop, and then tried to rape her, which, of course, was all true. But it was 1988, so GG said, well, I think that lady's exaggerating a little bit, and that's all the cops needed to hear. Case closed, just another hysterical woman. Oh, 1988. The cops told the crowd to disperse and leave poor GG alone, and then left. So the crowd didn't leave, and in fact began tailgating his hotel room, beating on his door till about 3 a.m. when everybody got too drunk and tired to care anymore. After the show, it was time to head back to New Hampshire, and somehow GG had convinced Tracy to let him move back in with her. Then it was back to New Hampshire for more drinking and fighting with Tracy. Luckily for GG, in 1988 his brother Merle was divorced and wanted to start a band, so they decided to put out an ad for a drummer and guitarist. In the meantime, Merle was dealing cocaine to make ends meet, and GG was doing a bunch of cocaine because it was around the house. It took a while, but eventually guitarist Nava and drummer Chris Burkoff joined the band. They called themselves, get ready for this one folks, the Aids Brigade. Nope, it's not a bunch of 11-year-olds, these are real grown men. Homestead wanted to release a single before the next album, so the band began to practice. When they weren't practicing, they were hanging out in Boston at their new favorite club, The Rat. It was near the practice space, and they hadn't banned GG yet. GG had become more prone to irrational violence with Merle around. His never-ending supply of cocaine and generosity left GG tweaked out of his mind even worse than usual. It also meant that he never had to stop drinking. Eventually, it was time to record, and they didn't waste any time. They recorded all 3 songs the first night in a coke-fueled nightmare. They returned the next night just as high to mix the songs. In 2 short days, they completed the Expose Yourself to Kids EP and released it in 1988. Again, guys, the vocals are the least impressive part of these 3 songs, and the lyrics themselves are pretty dumb. Sadly, after the record was released, they had no gigs to prepare for, so the band just sort of stopped practicing. With nothing to do again, GG hung around the apartment and made Tracy's life awful. They both drank and fought way too much, and eventually it was actually GG who said, you know what, I think I can do better, and he left her. He got a job at a wire company and a room at another boarding house downtown. For the next year, GG stayed locked away in his room, emerging to go to work and wander the streets high or drunk out of his mind. He had stopped writing music and had no interest in touring or recording. He sat in his room, covered in Jim Beam bottles, eating peanut butter from the jar with a dirty spoon he kept in a baggie and an even dirtier syringe he kept for mainlining cocaine. He wasn't allowed in most of the clubs in town, and he traded his music friends for winos and bums. Then one day, out of the blue, he got a letter and a tape from a band called Bulge. They offered to be GG's band if he ever needed one. And after a year of exile, GG was ready to make an album again. He felt like people were ripping off his shows from bootlegs that were being traded around the scene, and to some extent he was right. He had pushed the limits of punk rock and people were getting more extreme, but not like him. Eventually, GG wrote back to Bulge and told them he was ready to record an album. They drove up from Boston and recorded the songs without any rehearsal. The next day, GG had the lyrics ready and they recorded and began mixing. Now, what's not clear to me is, did GG write all the music? Did he give them some music and then they turned it into songs? In all of the research I did, it's never been terribly clear how much GG could write music. From what I gathered, he mostly stuck to the lyrics and had a general tune, but I have no idea. When they were done mixing, GG titled the album Freaks, Drunks, and Junkies, and it was released by Homestead in 1988. I tried to listen to this album, and I had to stop. I would rather listen to Slipknot. It's childish, gross, and mostly not very good. After the album, GG went into a self-imposed exile again, drinking and yelling at shadows in his room. He would have remained there had he not received a letter from Mike Edison and the Shakes, telling him they had a gig lined up for him in Montreal. It was a 3-day event called the Shock Art Festival, featuring acts from around the world. GG liked the sound of it, but he had a problem. He was still working at the wire company, and if he left, they would definitely fire him, and he wouldn't have enough money to pay for the room in his boarding house. But since it was GG Allin, and he can do nothing but make the worst decisions ever, he said fuck it and bought a bus ticket to Canada. However, when he hit customs, there was a problem. Looking as he did, he was one of the people chosen at random for additional screening. When GG told them all he had for luggage was the clothes on his back and a brown paper sack with a jar of peanut butter, some X-Lax, and a moldy jockstrap, they only had more questions. GG was somehow able to convince them that it was a medical device, and after holding up the entire bus for 2 hours, they finally let him into the country. Once in Montreal, he met up with the other bands playing the festival and proceeded to do the usual GG things like get drunk, fight with his friends, and let random women urinate on him in the middle of a party. Nothing special. One day, GG met up with a guy named Fudgy who introduced GG to a stripper friend of his. GG made fast friends and convinced the girl to come dance on stage during their concert without giving the girl any information about his concert or what would be happening. He also didn't tell the band that there was going to be a stripper on stage during that night's show, so nobody but GG knew what was about to happen. At showtime, the band went out and warmed up the crowd with an instrumental, expecting GG to come on stage and begin singing. Instead, a stripper walked out on stage naked and began to entertain the crowd while the band played harder. Then GG came out. Immediately, GG climbed on top of this woman and began performing oral sex on her while rubbing all over her body. He could tell she was a little surprised, but she went along with it at first. However, what he did next, she was not into at all and did not go along with. GG crouched over her and began to empty his bowels. He then began to scoop it up and spit it at the crowd. While he did so, he placed the microphone cord around the woman's neck and began to choke her while forcing her to commit sex acts on him. When GG stood up, she immediately ran from the stage, visibly very upset, but it was 1988, so nobody stopped it and nobody followed up. Then it was more of the usual GG stuff. He bit and clawed at himself and the audience a little bit. He bashed his head, made his face bloody, attacked the audience for about 20 minutes straight, and then, called it a night. Backstage, the stripper was understandably furious. GG had lied to her and betrayed her trust on stage, which to anyone who knows him was completely predictable, but must have been absolutely awful for her. On the bus ride home, GG noticed his body hurt a little bit more than usual. When he got back to Manchester, he stopped at the old emergency room to learn that he had a broken shoulder and once again blood poisoning, and would have to spend the next couple of weeks in a hospital. When he got out, he learned he had in fact been fired from the wire company, and he only had enough rent to stay in his boarding house for 3 more weeks. So, he did what he always did. GG headed back to Tracy's house. After a year apart, GG wasn't sure if she would even answer the door, but she did, and somehow, he convinced her to let him move back in. And because all of Tracy's friends hated GG, she spent all of her time with him. And since all he did was get fucked up and try to fight people, that's what she did. Things came to a head one evening at a club called the Salty Dog. GG was belligerently drunk and needling other patrons to try to start a fight. Just as he ordered 2 more drinks, 4 cops entered the bar and went to GG's table. They told him it was time to leave and that they had had a lot of complaints from the staff and guests. However, having just paid for 2 drinks, GG demanded that he be allowed to finish his beverages before he head home. The cops said, well, you can go home or you can go to jail, to which GG replied by spitting in the cop's face. So they handcuffed, beat, and jailed him promptly. Tracy became so violent in the altercation, they managed to arrest her too. She had her mom to come bail her out, and then she bailed out Gigi. The damage was done though. Gigi was officially on the cops' radar, and not as a punk rocker, but as a vagrant known for physically and sexually assaulting strangers. He was even back in jail less than a week after that club arrest for public indecency when they caught him pissing on the sidewalk. So he started spending more time around Boston with his brother Merle, who was now divorced and looking to party. However, it didn't take long for the cops in Boston to catch on, and Gigi kept getting arrested for some version of drunken disorderly conduct week to week. He was so hated by the police that the Lowell Police Department came and arrested him for something that he had done at a Jabber show in the early 80s, just to hassle him. Eventually, Gigi got out and set up a couple of tour dates so he could get the hell out of town with the band The Murderers. Gigi himself didn't have a band, so the plan was to play to taped music, which wasn't all that bad because it meant all of the attention would be on him. To kick off the tour, they traveled to New Jersey, where Gigi was to debate a spokesman for the Parents Music Resource Center on the Morton Downey Jr. show, which is somewhere between a Donahue and a Jerry Springer. It's hard to describe. It wasn't total trash, but it also lowered the standards for journalism for the next 30 years. The van ride from Boston got pretty rowdy, and everyone but Merle and his girlfriend Mishi showed up to the Red Roof Inn drunk out of their minds. When Gigi was done partying with the murderers for the night, he went to the room he was sharing with Merle, only to discover that the door was locked and no one was inside. Not known for his patience, Gigi kicked in the door. This was enough to stir the murderers from their room to go see what Gigi was up to. Now, what happened next is a bit of a debate. But in short, Gigi, with some slight help from the band, destroyed this room. The police report lists the following. Quote, television smashed. Air conditioner destroyed. All windows broken. Multiple walls spray painted with swastikas, and quote, GG Allin and the murderers kill all. End quote. Human feces smeared over the bed. A Bible was placed in the toilet and vomited on. Okay, that's kind of funny. And multiple walls kicked in. Needless to say, they were all kicked out that night and had to sleep on the roof of the Channel 9 TV station, waiting to record the next day. The next day, while attending a different TV taping as audience members, the entire building was surrounded and Gigi was ordered out. When he walked outside, he was arrested and booked for malicious destruction over $5,000, and his bail was set at $10,000. At 10%, he could get himself bailed out for $1,000, but Merle, Mishi, and the band only had about $300 between them. So after a very long talk with his mother, she wired Merle the rest of the cash. The arrest canceled the tour and they decided to head back to Boston, but not without a little stop in New York City for a party on the Lower East Side. They had almost no money, but that night Gigi was treated to 5 $10 baggies of very fine heroin. And much like the first time he shot cocaine, this was instantly his new favorite thing and he had no idea how he had been living without it this long. Lucky for him, heroin is not cheap and the most plentiful thing on the planet, so he was mostly at the mercy of other people's charity to share their heroin. And for any of you curious, most people don't share their heroin, because, it's heroin. Anyway, after the canceled tour, Gigi returned to Boston where he stayed for a few months with Tracy sporadically coming to visit. On one such trip, Gigi ignored her and openly made out and fondled another woman in front of her, as he had many times before. But this time, Tracy had had enough. She left furious and returned to Manchester, where she attempted to take her own life. Luckily, she was unsuccessful, and Gigi returned to visit Tracy and once again enjoy her empty apartment while she was in the hospital. By the end of 1988, Gigi had legal problems starting to stack up. He had 3 upcoming court appearances in New Hampshire and the New Jersey hotel incident, and so he decided to skip those court dates and hide out in Chicago with his buddy Sharon, the same woman he stole that $200 and all of her rare records. The really crazy thing is once he got into Chicago, he couldn't sit still and then immediately just started doing shows in New York. So I don't know why he left Boston to go to Chicago to go back to New York, but he's also doing a lot of drugs and has pretty much had a pickled brain for the last 5 years, so, who knows why he does anything. Also, the show in New York to kick off the tour wasn't really a show. It was actually a low point for Gigi. He had gotten a bunch of heroin from his connection from the last time he was there, and it was literally him sitting under a table for 4 hours doing heroin before being dragged up to the stage and doing a faceplant not once, but twice into the crowd. So that was basically canceled. The next show of the tour was in San Francisco, and it would be a different story. This show, speed was the drug of choice, and for once the crowd seemed to know what they had signed up for. GG did all the classics: nudity, sex acts, poop, blood, only this time people didn't leave. Sure, they were running and tackling each other and didn't exactly want to be covered in somebody else's shit, but they weren't leaving. This is what they wanted. People were cheering and smiling and egging each other on. The set was a full 25 minutes, and when done, GG was wrecked. Once again, it was a very long bus ride back to Chicago, and GG began to swell. When he arrived, he checked himself into the hospital for another one of those patented 2-week stays before checking himself out by simply removing all of his IVs and walking away. In 1989, GG Allin wrote into fanzine Maximum Rock and Roll to declare that he would kill himself on stage on October 31st, a claim that he would make often going forward. He also began exchanging letters with serial killer John Wayne Gacy, but more on that in a little bit. GG spent most of 1989 sporadically touring to curious and then mostly angry crowds. He was doing more spoken word mixed in with his songs, but all of it was still very loud and gross. His reputation was bringing in more people, but it was also bringing in more police attention and complaints by concerned citizens. For whatever reason, GG was constantly being arrested during this tour for doing all the usual things that he had been doing, like getting naked, pooping, violently attacking people that paid to be there, all that stuff. What would concern a normal person, of course, to GG was a mark of success, but he was also a severe alcoholic and drug addict, so success was a weird barometer. As for his legal troubles, it wasn't like GG planned on sticking around long enough to face any of the charges, so if a show ended with him in handcuffs, all the better, it just added to his legend. In April of that year, GG got the great idea to perform an unscheduled show at the University of Michigan dormitory open mic night. It was an absolute disaster, with everybody very unhappy that GG and the band had shown up, but luckily for GG, he managed to get off the stage and out to a waiting car just as the cops were showing up. He took off to a party with a woman he had just met with the band, leaving the police to gather witness statements. Witnesses told the officers that the man on stage had masturbated, kicked a U of M woman in the stomach, and hit another student with a chair. The band was, of course, GG Allin and the Toilet Rockers, a very funny name. That May, Ouachita County issued warrants for GG Allin's arrest on charges of indecent exposure and assault and battery, which were not new charges for GG Allin. However, at the same time, a felony warrant was also authorized charging Allin with assault with intent to do great bodily harm less than murder. As I mentioned, GG escaped the club with a woman he had just met moments before the cops arrived. But, as it turned out, the depravity and violence experienced by those students that night was just a drop in the bucket compared to what GG had planned. It took all the way until September to catch GG, and how the authorities did is incredibly strange. GG was driving through southern Illinois, near St. Louis, when he was pulled over by the U.S. Secret Service. They were researching people that had been in contact with John Hinckley, the guy who tried to kill Reagan, and it turns out GG had tried to contact him because he had a fascination with everybody who was not popular. When the Secret Service ran his name, they saw that he had all those warrants in Ann Arbor and got him sent to Michigan by way of the Chicago jail. On September 14, 1989, GG was arraigned in district court on all 3 charges. GG, of course, pled not guilty. In sworn testimony, the woman claims that GG left the music co-op open mic with her that night and returned to her apartment. Once there, GG had sex with the woman while she was handcuffed to a bed. He burned her with cigarettes and cut several half-moon shapes with the jagged edge of a beer can on the bottom of her breasts, burned her, and then dripped hot wax into that wound, resulting in 12 days in the hospital, some of them in intensive care. GG's defense to all of this was it was consensual rough sex and she did all the exact same things to him, so he didn't understand what the big deal was. And despite some of that being kind of true, and a few inconsistencies in the woman's story, her wounds were very real, and GG's reputation was not going to win over a jury. While arrested, GG was also submitted to various psychological exams, and the doctors noted he was surprisingly courteous, cooperative, and he did not appear to be psychotic and was very comfortable with his quote-unquote absurd lifestyle. He was dependent on drugs and alcohol and diagnosed with a mixed personality disorder consisting of narcissistic, borderline, and masochistic tendencies. That plus the mountain of evidence and GG's reputation, he knew he wasn't likely to win. So he took a deal and pleaded no contest to felonious assault and was sentenced to 18 months in prison beginning Christmas Day, 1989. While in prison, GG was forced to get mostly sober and he was miserable. Faced with no booze, nor women, Allin doubled down on his masturbation, resulting in a sad and scabby penis that we should all not feel bad about because this is an awful human being. He'd pass the time by smashing his face into the bars to simulate being intoxicated, but that only works so much, and eventually you just get a headache. And if all that doesn't sound like enough fun, he also caught the chicken pox of all things, something that I've heard is way worse as an adult, and again, I do not feel bad about because this guy is a real piece of garbage. GG tried to live by his own rules and learned that that doesn't really fly in prison. His no baths and no cleaning meant that he got a shaved head, a delousing, a cold hose, and some time in the hole for making the guards have to deal with him. With a lot of free time on his hands and likely a lot of alcohol-induced brain trauma, GG would call people collect and leave long, rambling messages about a quote-unquote real underground rock and roll army that would be under his command and other delusional nonsense that adults with jobs just do not have time for. If you're curious just how delusional, I will direct you to a document called the GG Allin Manifesto that was written from prison. This is the opening to it, and you tell me if this doesn't sound like some Corey Feldman tweet nonsense. Quote, "If you believe in the real underground rock and roll, then now is the time to do something about it. The time is now to overthrow the current situations and declare war on the record companies, radio stations, publications, clubs, and anyone who promotes the whole so-called scene as it now stands. We need to destroy it all and take it back from the corporate phonies and conformists. But action must be taken now, and blood must be spilled." End quote. It goes on like that, folks. Believe it or not, I read the whole gosh darn thing, and let me tell you, it is embarrassing. He also claimed to be Jesus Christ, God, and the devil all wrapped into one, and I don't think it was a metaphor. This is also when GG began writing back and forth with serial killer John Wayne Gacy. See, I told you we'd get back to it. He even commissioned a painting from Gacy for $200 that would later become the poster for the Hated documentary by Mr. Todd Phillips. Eventually, that correspondence was, of course, put to an end when the letters were intercepted. Allegedly, Gacy's final letters to GG were that of a hurt and confused man, not sure why GG decided to stop writing him without explanation. After 15 agonizing months, GG was released on March 26, 1991, with a one-way bus ticket to Ann Arbor and a $250 parole loan he had no intention of paying back. He got to Ann Arbor, cashed his check, got some cigarettes, and went for a walk downtown. He had only been there a short time when GG walked smack dab into the very woman that had sent him to prison for torturing her. She asked when he had been released and how it felt to be free. GG said he wasn't sure, but he'd let her know and that he'd be around. The woman replied they shouldn't have let him out and then walked away, clearly upset. GG got himself a weekly room at the local Y and just started to relax when there was a pounding at his door. He opened up to find the police were there to inform GG that a restraining order had been put out against him, and if he came within immediate contact of his victim, he would be arrested. GG didn't care. He didn't plan on being there long. He had been writing songs while he was locked up and was ready to record an album. He still had a contract with Rose Records out of France, and a record session had been set up in Charlotte, North Carolina. Anti-Scene had been chosen as the backing band while GG was still in prison, and they recorded all of the music so that GG just had to lay down the vocals and some backup work when he got to North Carolina. The album was titled Murder Junkies, and it's a reference to an obscure Texas band that was released in June of 1991. The day after the recording in North Carolina, at an in-store appearance, GG again claimed that he would kill himself on stage, this time on Halloween 1992. GG returned to Ann Arbor, where he sort of became the local troll. Everyone avoided him on the street, no one made eye contact, and everyone knew exactly who he was. Or at least they'd heard rumors about the rapist that was living among them. GG didn't care. He wasn't there to make friends. He would just sit in his room at the Y and drink until he passed out and woke up in his piss bed, flip over the mattress, and start all over again. If he hadn't been drinking himself stupid, Allin might have realized that his lawyer, Peter Goldberg, was trying desperately to get a hold of him. He had had the impossible task of preparing for GG's upcoming trial in Milwaukee that July. GG had been charged with disorderly conduct from a performance he did at the Odd Rock Cafe in Milwaukee in 1989 before being locked up. The prosecution claimed to have reports that Mr. Allin, quote, came out nude, dragged a female on stage, simulated sex acts, assaulted the audience, defecated on stage, and then threw it at said audience. Which, is probably guilty as charged. That all sounds about right. Once GG learned of the impending trial, and before likely going to jail again, he flew out to Lowell, Mass. To cut his 5-song EP. The songs were written on the spot and probably could have used a couple more drafts, if you ask me, but at least GG was taking the opportunity to actually get something done and recorded, rather rather than sitting under his desk drinking himself stupid. No sooner had he returned to Ann Arbor, GG got another work pass to fly out to Tampa and record again and do another store appearance. The trip was madness, as only GG can create. There was excessive drinking, partying with strippers, utter destruction of the house he was staying in, post-coital urine drinking, and somehow they still made a store appearance. By July of 1991, GG's legend had grown, and he had a real following. He arrived at the store to find it packed with fans ready to buy all the merch and records he'd brought. He even smashed his face on the counter and bled on people's records while he signed them. A few days later, GG recorded several songs to create a very different kind of GG Allin record. The music is a mix of honky-tonk, blues, jazz, ragtime, all set to GG Allin's very poor singing and recitation of spoken word. Even stranger, originally it was supposed to be all acoustic. GG arrived in Milwaukee on August 18, 1991, and the trial began a week later. It was a media circus from the start. Local papers and national broadcasters hounded Allin as he walked in and out of the courthouse, but he remained silent. GG's defense was that it was his First Amendment right to express himself as he chose for his art while on stage. The prosecution's argument was that throwing poop is not art, and you can't commit crimes just because you're standing on a stage. GG made no effort to gain any jury sympathy. He wore the same dog collar, smelly clothes, and combat boots that he always did, and you better believe he didn't hit the shower or brush his hair. If that wasn't bad enough, half the time he was having loud arguments with his own lawyer because he didn't agree with his strategy. It was just a total shit show. The jury heard testimony and saw video of the performance in question, and at the end of a week needed only 2 hours to find GG guilty. The judge sentenced Allin to 60 days in jail and fined him $1,500. His lawyer appealed, and GG was let out on bond pending appeal. When he left court that day, he was finally ready to make his statement saying, quote, "I'm not guilty. I don't give a shit what the jury said. They're just a bunch of narrow-minded, hypocritical, robotic puppets of society who look like my dead grandmother. They're just trying to kill the real underground rock and roll, in which I am the king. But they can't do it. They'll never be able to stop me. This won't change anything. I'll continue to do just as I fucking damn well please. Fuck them cunts. Rock and roll lives on in me. I'm God, Jesus Christ, and Satan all rolled into one. There is no higher power than GG Allin." End quote. He then made another statement about his future suicide plans and walked away. The next day, GG Allin was on the front pages of every paper across this country for his outrageous looks and statements. A couple days after that, he had back-to-back shows in Muskogee and Detroit, but something was wrong. Both nights the clubs were packed to see the now famous GG Allin, but it didn't feel right. In his words, GG, quote, wasn't getting what he needed. He largely ignored the audience, half sang for 10 or 15 minutes, and then just said, "Fuck it, this isn't working," before leaving the stage. The publicity from the Milwaukee trial had brought a lot of attention to GG, and his parole officer in Ann Arbor thought it would be a good idea if he lay low for a bit. GG thought this was a really stupid idea and had his brother Merle set up 3 gigs in New York and Philadelphia with his new band, the Murder Junkies. The band was comprised of Chicken John on guitar, Dino D on drums, and Merle on bass. Now, I didn't do much research on these guys, but the drummer Dino played naked most of the time and had a previous conviction for exposing himself to a very young girl. So these are not great people. It turned out this band was just what GG was looking for. His funk was over, and on August 29th, his birthday, they took the stage at the Fast Lane in New Jersey. This was GG's first big release since he had been let out of prison, and the band played for over 50 horrifying minutes. GG sang and raged all over the audience and himself. The next night in Philly was mediocre by comparison, but was just practice for the New York show that was to follow. Fueled on Jim Beam, cocaine, and pure prison rage, the band exploded onto the stage, and GG physically and sexually assaulted the front row of a sold-out crowd. He pooped on stage, ate some of it, threw the rest at a cheering crowd, and the band made it through 35 minutes before leaving the stage bloody and drained. Then they returned for a very rare encore. GG dripping in blood and fluid, set to carving his torso with a broken glass while singing "I Wanna Fuck Myself." After New York, a proper tour with the Junkies was booked and they started to California. However, after just 2 shows, GG had to be hospitalized. He wasn't the only one. Several crowd members had broken bones at these shows as well. But GG once again had several severe infections and had to have all the glass removed from various parts of his body. Against the doctor's orders, he checked himself out after a mere 4 days, and with a little help from booze and some mystery pills from a fan, GG performed that night. If he was a little less violent, nobody would have noticed because the crowd was making up for it. GG's shows were barely controlled riots from start to finish, with several of the members of the audience beating people worse than GG could. Allin still gave it his all and put on a poop-filled naked concert that satisfied everybody. The murder junkies packed up and drove straight to Dallas for their next gig. GG was in a bad mood for that show and attacked several people in the crowd that were recording him without permission, smashing their cameras against the walls. Frustrated, the band walked off stage after 20 minutes and began loading the van. The audience, feeling cheated, chased the van down the street, hurling rocks and bottles and even breaking the window next to GG's face. The next night, the show in San Antonio only lasted about 10 minutes before all the music was stopped because the band and audience were in a full-on war, hurling amps, instruments, and fists back and forth from the stage. After 15 minutes, the show was stopped, but not a single person complained. It was the violent madness they'd been searching for, and they were thrilled. After the show, GG led chants outside the club of "Violence Now" while he filleted a dog. It sounds disgusting. That night, GG got separated from his band when he followed a woman to her house for cocaine and more unconventional sex. When he returned to his hotel the next day, he learned that the band had been kicked out when one of the members, likely Dino, was found openly masturbating in the parking lot. Luckily, Allin found him down the road at another terrifying motel. Also worth noting, and I don't think the band had anything to do with this, but the owner of the club they played at in San Antonio was found dead floating in the river the next day. Again, I don't think anybody had anything to do with it, but weird timing. Next was a very quick and boring show in Houston before going all the way back up to Ann Arbor so that GG could meet with his parole officer, renew his travel pass, and then drive back down to Chicago for their next show at the Exit Club. This was one of GG's most intense shows. He took the stage before the band, and by the time the first note was played, he'd already urinated on himself and the crowd, pooped on stage, ate some of both, and threw the rest at people brave enough not to leave. Finally, before the band began, GG broke a bottle and dug the pieces into his head, draping his face in blood. Then began 35 minutes of chaos. The crowd loved it, and GG's show was the talk of the town on several local radio stations. Unfortunately, when GG got back to Ann Arbor, he was informed that he was no longer allowed to leave the state for at least 6 months. His parole officer had heard about his behavior at the first tour stop way back in California, and he was not happy. Unable to tour, GG immediately sank into a depression, drinking alone all day at his room in the Y. Then weirdly, one day 2 detectives show up at his door asking where's the boy. And for once, GG had literally no idea what they were talking about. Apparently, a child from New Hampshire had run away and left a note saying he was joining GG Allin. The police let GG know that they were watching, and this was no joke. And if anything happened to that boy, he would be arrested. From that moment on, GG could go nowhere in Ann Arbor without cops watching him. So he did what any of us would do. He violated his parole and booked a second tour. GG shipped his few belongings to Chicago in case he never got a chance to return, and headed out to New York City. A young film student by the name of Todd Phillips, who was going to NYU, had booked 2 shows in New York for GG, and so he hopped on a Greyhound. The first show was a spoken word show at NYU, and it was a disaster. After GG put a banana in his butt and threw it at everybody, he produced a lighter and some spray paint and demanded everybody get naked. As people began running for the door, security and police soon descended and the show was over. It was such a big deal that the concert the next night at an actual rock club was canceled because the owner got cold feet. So, in November of 1991, the murder junkies set out on their second tour, with GG now officially a fugitive from the law. The tour stretched across the South with stops in Nashville, Memphis, New Orleans, and Orlando. The shows were great and the crowds were getting bigger, but so was the police presence. At multiple stops, GG and the band were pulling away just as the police arrived to reports of a crazy naked man throwing chairs and chasing people down the street. In Orlando, GG and Dino didn't make it out in time, and they were charged with disorderly conduct. They posted bail and took off for their next gigs in Atlanta and Knoxville, never stopping to consider, oh hey, maybe we should stick around for our court dates. After Knoxville, it was back up to New York City because Phillips had set up another show for his documentary. The show lasted exactly 6 minutes before, ironically, while singing Kill the Police, 8 police cars worth of cops ran in and stopped the show dead. Angry the show was cut short, GG disappeared with a friend and did heroin all night. On December 8th, 1991, GG went on the Geraldo Rivera Show, a tabloid talk show that sort of straddled real news, but was definitely, not well regarded. Ready to tell millions of people about his message, GG went on and rambled some nonsense and mostly just sounded immature and kinda dumb. You can find videos of this online. It's really not worth your time. After the taping, GG decided to spend the holidays in Atlanta renting a room in a flop house above a strip club. But a couple of weeks quickly turned into a couple of months, and for the first time while the rock and roll world was paying attention to GG Allin, nobody could find him. There were articles in Spin, Cream, Screw, High Times, all of them declaring in one way or another that GG was the craziest guy in rock music, and you had to see it to believe it. At the time those articles were being written, he was also the most depressed. He barely left his room, he drank all night, did as many drugs as he could mooch off of other people, and then spent all day in bed with a dancer named Tasha, cutting each other, peeing everywhere, and pushing the general definitions of sex as I understand it. Even if GG had managed to answer the phone to take one of the many gigs he was being offered, which he didn't, he was physically incapable of doing a show while he was in Atlanta. He was bloated and strung out all the time. He could barely lift his arms. It wasn't until the manager of the room he was renting threatened to kick him out that GG finally said screw it and decided to return to Chicago to prepare for his next tour. The third tour with the Murder Junkies kicked off in February 1992. The first show was in the small town of Dalton, Georgia at a skate park. The show was shut down immediately, and once again, GG and Dino were arrested. Short on cash, they bailed out GG, drove to Atlanta, did the next show with the replacement drummer that they had, and then they went back to bail out Dino before they could go to the next show in New Orleans. The New Orleans show went really well, and GG went and sold most of the clothes off his back for some extra cash and food stamps before it was off to San Antonio. This show was less of a GG Allin concert and just more of a loose riot. As before, the club was packed and the crowd was electric, chanting GG before anyone had even taken the stage. When the show started, so did the riot. The whole audience was just beating the shit out of each other, and when they could reach him, they were beating the shit out of GG too. One guy got 2 cheap shots in before GG finally figured out who was doing it, grabbed the kid, pulled him on stage, and started beating the shit out of him, which was the green light for the rest of the audience to rush the stage and begin beating and kicking GG while destroying everything in sight. GG managed to escape backstage after about 15 minutes, which only made the place crazier. The club hadn't hired any security, so there wasn't any sign of stopping in sight. While Allin was nursing a bottle of Jim Beam in the back, half the audience was fighting the other half of the audience because half thought it was crazy that GG wasn't still playing, and the other half was defending him. Finally, the police were called and they broke the whole thing up, but not before GG left the show with 2 black eyes, a cracked jaw, and a broken hand from punching some guy. Next, he returned to Houston to make up for a lackluster performance the year prior, and he did. He did all the hits, the cutting, the punching, the pooping, the pissing. It was all there, and rounding it all together by giving himself a beer enema administered via turkey baster. He then Gallaghered the entire crowd with his body fluids, and it was off to Austin. The city had been abuzz with rumors that GG Allin was coming for weeks, so when he showed up at the Cavity Club on February 18th, 1992, the place was packed. GG came out in a trench coat, dog collar, and combat boots and did not disappoint. He raged all over the crowd, stealing a crutch from a poor girl before pushing her onto the ground and then chasing around the rest of the audience, swinging the crutch like an axe. Back on stage, he defecated and began putting bottles up his butt. Apparently, everyone thought this was just a really great time. They were wrapping up the 30-minute set when the room was fogged with mace and GG was on the ground being arrested. Outside, punk kids were pissing on cop car handles in protest before GG was yanked out the front door, loaded into the back of an ambulance, and taken to Breckenridge Hospital for examination. After some x-rays confirming his broken bones, they gave him a thorough deglassing and booked him into the Travis County Jail on all the usual charges. Rather than posting bail and moving on to the next town, though, the APD decided to run a background check to see if GG had any national warrants. They discovered GG had a warrant for his arrest, to revoke probation for his parole violations, and transferred him back to Michigan. The parole board did not appreciate GG violating his parole so that he could go get arrested in several other states, and they sent him back to prison for a little less than a year. Allin emerged from prison in 1993 undeterred and ready to get back out on the road. If anything, prison had made GG slightly more militant and strangely political, though I really struggled to discern any coherent perspective or ideology. He was also still claiming he would kill himself on stage, but was no longer claiming he would wait for Halloween. It was just going to happen when the time felt right, and not even the band would know it was coming. Mostly because they would try to stop him. After recording the album Brutality and Bloodshed for All for the Alive label, GG set out on tour with the Murder Junkies in late April. The band worked their way across the South, even stopping in Texas before working their way up to the West Coast. GG was still doing a lot of the same GG moves and to pack crowds, but some of the magic was gone. The crowds were a weird mix of fans, people who were curious if GG was going to kill himself on stage, and people that just wanted a place where they were allowed to fight random people. It was kind of a cluster. Not to mention, the police were always a threat, and GG's celebrity had not made things any easier. When not performing that tour, GG also took time to appear on local cable shows, including Jerry Springer. Also by this point, GG's body was an absolute wreck. He had been an alcoholic and just generally unhealthy human being by any standard for almost a decade, and you could see it. The tour worked its way back towards the East Coast with shows in Chicago and Detroit. At each stop, GG Allin did his best to bring people what they wanted, but there was a sense that for the audience, it was now more about the spectacle and not really about music at all. Expectations, alcoholism, and ego didn't help the situation either. GG welcomed the chaos of the shows, convinced he was the conductor of some grand experiment, and some nights he was, but other nights the crowds just hurled stuff at the band until they ran off stage and didn't seem to care less what music got played. GG returned to New York in June to attend the premiere of Philip's documentary about him called Hated. Much like GG, the film received mixed reviews. A few days after the premiere, GG and the Junkies also had a show at the gas station in the East Village. GG spent the day at his friend Johnny Puke's apartment preparing for the show. And by preparing, I do of course mean drinking heavily and doing multiple 8 balls of cocaine they were purchasing from a bodega across the street. That night, GG arrived at the club extra wired. He took the stage to a crowd of 200 and immediately broke the microphone. The sound guy attempted to call the show right then and there, but after several tense minutes of GG threatening to kill him, another microphone was produced and the band continued. GG was 3 songs into the show and had only punched 2 people in the face when he pooped on stage, rolled around in it a bit, and hurled it at the crowd. The 200-person crowd immediately became 10 as everybody ran for a nearby courtyard, fleeing the feces. GG, of course, chased them out, punching and throwing poop in anger. Then the tables turned. People in the courtyard found a large recycling bin filled with bottles and began shelling GG with bottles by the dozen. GG, fearing for his life, ran out to the street in a skirt with no underwear, a pair of combat boots, and the crowd cheered and followed. Allin could hear the police approaching and didn't need 80 people cheering behind him while he was basically naked and covered in shit and blood. He really didn't want to be arrested again, so he hailed a cab and jumped in. The cab driver, understandably, immediately ejected him given his appearance and general smell, and GG was forced to find a second cab. Lucky for him, the second driver took sympathy on GG and took him to his hotel before heading back over to Johnny Puke's for an evening of partying. It was just a foursome that night, GG and his girl Liz, Puke and his girlfriend. The show's promoter had given GG 10 bags of heroin, and so they got to snorting. GG would have preferred to inject it, of course, but Puke was scared of needles, so they stayed up drinking beer and snorting heroin. GG passed out, sitting halfway up, propped against the bed, and the other 3 stayed up till 2 in the morning listening to GG loudly snore in his upright position. The next morning, June 28, 1993, Liz found GG Allin in the exact same position that she had seen him the night before. He had died of a drug overdose in the night and had been frozen in that position. When the police arrived, they found GG and agreed he was in fact dead. He was wearing his jockstrap, sunglasses, and a Nazi hat that he loved so much he refused to wear it during shows for fear of someone stealing it. The police also found several Polaroids of GG in the exact same pose his dead body was in, with the girls and Puke posing next to what was obviously a corpse. So everybody got to go downtown for some questioning. The police wanted to know what kind of sick bastards would weekend at Bernie's their own friend once he had died by taking photos, but they all claimed the photos were taken with GG while he was still alive the night before and was actively snoring, and that he had died overnight and stiffened into the exact same pose. If you're curious, these photos are all over the internet and really aren't that interesting. It does kind of support their argument. He doesn't look dead. He looks like he's just sitting up. But based on everything else I know about these people, I'm going to all but guarantee you he was dead when they took those pictures. Anyway, lucky for them, the cops believed their story, and his death was ruled an accidental overdose. Now, some claim it was a calculated suicide by overdose, but I think it was just the usual GG Allin excess. He didn't do any more or less than he ever did, and it just finally caught up with him. Also, he wasn't an expert heroin user. You can't give somebody that much heroin who doesn't have a tolerance. Allin's funeral took place on July 3rd, 1993 in Littleton, New Hampshire. He had requested his body not be cleaned or tampered with at all after death, so he was still dressed in his jockstrap and leather jacket with a microphone in his hand as he was laid to rest next to newspaper clippings and his bruised, bloated corpse looking almost no different than it had in life. After his death, GG Allin's legacy lived on. Followers would often visit his headstone to leave booze or drugs, or more likely urinate or poop all over it. And really mostly, let's be serious, just kind of poop and pee all over it. There's pictures of this online too, but why in God's name would you look that that up. This became such a problem, actually, that eventually the headstone was removed by the cemetery and replaced with a simple ground plaque that remains stating GG Allin lies here. That, of course, also gets pooped on, but it's slightly easier to clean up. And that is the legacy of GG Allin, a place in a cemetery where people who like him go to shit on his grave. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed it. I know it's long. Truth be told, it was supposed to be a bit shorter, but I found some more sources just before I wrapped up, and I figure, why not go deep? What a horrible person, right? I hope you found it interesting. It's more just unbelievable than anything, but that is the story of Mr. GG Allin. After doing all the research and thinking about it, what do I think of this guy? Real piece of garbage, obviously. Was he talented? Yes. Was he talented at what he thought he was talented at? No. I think he had a moment where he could have been the godfather of pop punk, but instead chose whatever the hell it is he did instead. The guy had a decent sensibility for pop music. He had a great background in it, and his taste in bands like the MC5 could have really progressed things, but instead he chose to shit all over himself and get attention like a toddler. I suspect he had serious brain damage, or at the very least emotional damage from those early years, and that likely accounts for all of it. It's not as interesting or fun, but it at least makes sense. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back to normal next week. As always, folks, if you can, we need the 5 stars, please. For the love of God, give us the 5 stars. If that's not where you listen or you don't have that software, please rate, review, subscribe anywhere you can. We really do appreciate it. Tell your friends, tell your pets, tell your grandma. You got to listen to WIHTA. Also, reach out to us on Instagram. That's HatePod. Twitter's Album HatePod. I'm G Harvey Tweets on Twitter. If you want to talk to me, I'll talk to you. I got nothing to do. Or you can email us directly, hatepodmail@gmail.com. For Why I Hate This Album, I have been one of your hosts, Garrett Harvey. Next week, we shall return. Same bat time, same bat channel with my good buddy, Timothy Richardson.
There's cowboys running through my dreams. Nothing's quite the way it seems. I joined the Navy, got kicked out in a week. My facial features aren't distinct. Try to find some meaning in these songs. The genius is a genius, got it wrong. No, it's a lobster murder sex thing. It's the bleaching of the rear. A full assault on both your ears. The riffs are too repetitive. The lyrics make no sense. All the songs are B-sides. The cover art's a mess. Listen to it for a week. Now that week has passed. It's the Why I Hate This Album podcast with Tim and Gil.